Hello and welcome to the Biological Anthropology lecture series. I'm Dr. Richard Jonathan O. Tadurin. Here we explore what it means to be human, biologically, evolutionarily, and behaviorally. Let's begin our journey into the science of humanity. Welcome to Module 11, the Agricultural Revolution. Here we explore how the agricultural revolution reshaped human biology, health, and our evolutionary trajectory. In this section, we examine how agriculture changed human biology, including skeletal structure, disease patterns, and nutrition. Let's revisit what population looked like before agriculture. For most of human history, foraging societies were relatively small and mobile. Birth spacing was long, partly because breastfeeding lasted several years, and mobility made caring for multiple young children difficult. Mortality was high, but population growth was slow and fairly stable. In evolutionary terms, humans lived close to the carrying capacity of their environments. Now, let's look at what changed with the adoption of farming. Agriculture fundamentally altered the balance between births and deaths. Sedentary life made it easier to raise more children at the same time. Stored foods like grains and porridges allowed infants to be weaned earlier, which shortened the interval between births. Think about that for a moment. Even a small reduction in birth spacing, repeated over generations, can dramatically increase population size. Population growth under agriculture was not driven by people living much longer lives. Instead, it was driven primarily by higher fertility. Archaeological evidence shows that early farming communities often experienced poor health and high mortality, especially among infants and children. Yet populations still grew because more children were being born overall. You might wonder why this matters. It helps explain why agriculture spread and persisted even when individual health sometimes declined. Let's consider this as a feedback loop. Farming supports higher population densities, but higher populations also increased dependence on farming. As communities grew, returning to foraging became increasingly difficult. More mouths to feed meant more land had to be cleared and cultivated, reinforcing agricultural lifestyles. Population growth, in this sense, was both a consequence and a cause of agricultural expansion. Now, think about the broader implications. Larger populations meant more labor was available for farming, construction, and defense. At the same time, denser settlements increased vulnerability to food shortages, disease outbreaks, and social tension. Population growth amplified both the benefits and the risks of agricultural life. From an evolutionary perspective, this demographic shift is profound. Agriculture did not simply change how many people existed, it changed the scale at which humans interacted with each other and their environments. Larger populations increased cultural transmission, innovation, and social complexity, but they also placed new stresses on bodies and ecosystems. As we move forward, keep this idea in mind. The rise in human population following agriculture set the stage for everything that followed: cities, states, and global societies. Understanding how and why populations grew helps us see agriculture not just as a subsistence strategy, but as a powerful demographic engine that reshaped the human story. Let's revisit a key idea we've touched on already. Bones respond to how they are used. The human skeleton is not just a passive framework. It is a living tissue that remodels itself in response to activity, diet, and stress. When humans shifted from foraging to farming, they placed their bodies under very different physical demands, and those demands left clear signatures in skeletal remains. Let's look at overall body build first. Foraging populations tended to be relatively robust, with strong limb bones shaped by frequent movement over long distances. Early agricultural populations, by contrast, often show a decline in skeletal robusticity. Bones become thinner and less dense, especially in the lower limbs. This doesn't mean farmers were weak, but it does suggest that daily activity patterns changed. Farming involved repetitive, localized labor rather than constant long-distance mobility. Think about the difference between walking miles each day and working the same fields year after year. The skeleton adapts accordingly. One of the most visible changes associated with agriculture appears in the skull and jaws. Diets based on softer, processed foods, such as cooked grains, required less chewing force than the tough, fibrous foods eaten by foragers. Over generations, this reduced mechanical stress led to smaller jaws and faces. Teeth, however, did not shrink at the same rate. You might wonder why this matters. This mismatch helps explain why dental crowding and malocclusion become much more common in agricultural populations. Let's stay with teeth for a moment. Agricultural diets were often high in carbohydrates, especially starchy grains. This shift dramatically increased rates of dental caries. In foraging populations, cavities are relatively rare. In early farming communities, they become widespread. Enamel wear patterns also change, reflecting different food textures and preparation methods. Teeth, in this sense, become some of the clearest indicators of dietary change in the archaeological record. The skeleton also records changes in workload and physical stress. Farming demanded long hours of repetitive labor, planting, harvesting, grinding grain, carrying water. These activities left marks on bones in the form of joint degeneration, spinal compression, and muscle attachment changes. Osteoarthritis becomes more common even in relatively young individuals. Think about what that tells us. Agricultural life may have produced more food, but it often came with increased physical strain. Stature provides another important clue. Many early farming populations show a decline in average height compared to their foraging ancestors. This is usually linked to nutrition, especially during childhood. Diets that relied heavily on a few staple crops often lack sufficient protein and micronutrients. Growth was frequently disrupted, leading to shorter adult stature. You might wonder whether this improved over time. In many regions it did, but only after agricultural systems became more productive and diversified. Now, let's step back and connect these patterns. None of these skeletal changes reflect sudden genetic evolution. Instead, they reveal how human biology responds plastically to new environments. The same species, living under different conditions, develops different bodies. This is a powerful reminder that biology and culture are deeply intertwined. As we consider these skeletal and physiological changes, keep one key idea in mind. Agriculture did not transform human bodies in a single direction toward improvement. It reshaped them in response to new demands, new diets, and new stresses. The skeleton preserves this history in remarkable detail, allowing us to read the biological consequences of one of the most significant transitions in human life. Understanding these changes helps us see agriculture for what it was, not just a way of producing food, but a force that fundamentally reworked the human body, sometimes in ways that benefited survival, and sometimes in ways that came at a cost. Let's revisit an idea that often surprises students. Agriculture fed more people, but it did not automatically make people healthier. When we examine skeletal and archaeological evidence from early farming communities, a consistent pattern emerges. Many indicators of health actually worsen after the adoption of agriculture. That doesn't mean farming was a mistake, but it does mean it came with real biological costs. Let's look first at disease. Permanent settlements brought people, animals, waste, and water sources into close and continuous contact. Think about how different that is from small, mobile foraging groups. Dense populations created ideal conditions for infectious diseases to spread and persist. Pathogens that might have burned out quickly among foragers could now circulate year after year. Skeletal evidence shows increases in lesions linked to chronic infections, including diseases associated with crowding and poor sanitation. Agriculture also changed what people ate, and those changes had consequences. early farming diets were often dominated by a small number of staple crops. While these foods provided calories, they were frequently low in key nutrients. As a result, many early agricultural populations show signs of nutritional stress. Iron deficiency becomes more common, leaving traces in cranial bone changes. Episodes of childhood malnutrition appear as enamel hypoplasias, visible interruptions in tooth development that permanently record periods of stress. Let's stay with diet for a moment. Reliance on carbohydrates increased dental problems dramatically. Cavities, abscesses, and tooth loss are far more common in farming populations than in foragers. You might wonder why this matters beyond oral health. Dental infections can spread, affect nutrition, and increase the risk of systemic illness. Teeth, once again, give us a clear window into the everyday health challenges of agricultural life. Another major cost was vulnerability to famine. Farming ties survival to a limited set of crops and seasonal cycles. When harvests failed due to drought, pests, or flooding, the consequences could be severe. Foraging economies were often more flexible, allowing people to shift food sources. Agricultural societies, by contrast, were more exposed to large-scale shortages. Archaeological evidence suggests that periods of crop failure were accompanied by spikes in stress markers and mortality. Now think about how these factors interact. Poor nutrition weakens immune systems. Dense living conditions increase disease transmission. Heavy workloads tax already stressed bodies. Together, these pressures help explain why many early farming populations show higher rates of illness despite producing more food overall. You might wonder why agriculture persisted if it carried so many health costs. The answer lies in population dynamics. Farming supported more people, even if those people were, on average, less healthy. From an evolutionary perspective, agriculture was successful at the population level, not necessarily at the individual level. As we move forward, keep this distinction in mind. The health costs of farming remind us that cultural changes can reshape biology in uneven ways. Agriculture did not improve human health across the board, it redistributed risks and benefits. Understanding those trade-offs helps us see modern health problems not as failures of biology, but as echoes of choices made thousands of years ago. First, let's revisit what this section has shown us. The adoption of agriculture did not just reshape societies, it reshaped human bodies in measurable, lasting ways. When people changed how they moved, what they ate, and where they lived, their skeletons, teeth, and health profiles responded. These changes were not abstract. They were written directly into bone. Let's look again at the overall pattern. Early farming populations often experienced population growth alongside declining individual health. Skeletons became less robust, jaws and faces reduced in size, and signs of physical stress increased. You might wonder why this matters. It challenges the idea that cultural change automatically leads to biological improvement. Instead, it shows us that evolution responds to trade-offs, not ideals. Now, this part is important. Many of the health costs associated with early agriculture, nutritional deficiencies, infectious disease, dental problems, and physical strain, stem from a mismatch between bodies, shaped by a foraging past and a rapidly changing way of life. Human biology did not fail. It struggled to keep pace with cultural transformation. That struggle left clear evidence that bioarchaeologists can still read thousands of years later. Think about how powerful that insight is. The same species, living under different subsistence systems, develops different health profiles. This tells us that biology and culture cannot be separated. They co-evolve, constantly shaping one another. As we move forward, keep this perspective in mind. Agriculture succeeded at feeding more people, but it did so by redistributing risks and costs across bodies and generations. Understanding those costs helps us see early farmers not as healthier or weaker than their foraging ancestors, but as humans adapting, sometimes imperfectly, to a new world they themselves had created. In the next section, we'll step back and ask a broader question. What does agriculture teach us about how humans now drive their own evolution, and why does that matter for understanding the evolutionary present? Thank you for joining this lecture. I'm Dr. Richard Jonathan O. Tadurin. I hope this session deepened your understanding of biological anthropology. Keep exploring what it means to be human. See you soon.